Hello, and welcome to another webinar presented by the Rural Policy Learning Commons and the Rural Development Institute at Brandon University. Today's webinar is being recorded, and copies of the video and presentation slides can be accessed from the RDI and RPLC websites as indicated at the bottom of your screen. Please visit our websites for additional related research works, resources, and how you can engage with our network. Today's topic, Hutterites in North America, Confronting the Digital Age, gives insights on the perception that Hutterites are physically isolated, but in actual fact, they do use technology in their community. Some Hutterites in Manitoba are linked to fiber optics to teaching in schools. Hutterites closer to Brandon use state-of-the-art technology towards diversifying their work, specializing in metal, plastics, and wood. They also have satellite farms, which have sophisticated farm machines using satellite images for which side of the farm needs to be sprayed. Hutterites also have the expertise in growing crops and improving soil moisture for cultivation. Hutterites have learned to adapt to a world where exposure to the values of the secular world poses increasingly complex dilemmas while adding to the industrial strength and diversity of rural Canada. Today's presenter, John Lehr, is a senior scholar at the University of Winnipeg. He is a historical geographer with geographically diverse research interests, including image building, ethnic and religious settlement in Western Canada, communal settlements in North America, Israel and Japan, and Ukrainian settlements in Brazil and Argentina. It is my pleasure to welcome John Lehr.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I have a long-standing interest in the Hutterian communities in North America, and I've been researching them for the past, 20 years with my colleague from Bar-Ilan University in Tel Aviv, Dr. Yossi Katz. Yossi and I built up a strong relationship with the Hutterite Brethren. It takes a long time to win their trust and to be accepted by them, but over the years we've come to know them very well. Before I go any further, I should point out that my knowledge of the Hutterites is mostly based upon experiences with the Hutterites in Manitoba and North Dakota, which belong to a specific branch of the Hutterites, the Schmiedelite. Hutterites are not all the same. There are differences, but they're essentially minor. So things that I say today in general can be taken as applicable to most of the Hutterite communities scattered across the prairies and the northern plains. So I'll just get my PowerPoint to work here, which is not doing. First thing is, who are the Hutterites? Well, many of you perhaps are less familiar than others, but they are German-speaking Anabaptists. They believe in the community of goods after a passage in the New Testament that said that the believers had held all things in common. And they arose out of the Reformation in Europe alongside other groups such as the Mennonites and the Amish and so forth. They were Anabaptists, they were pacifists, and they were, of course, persecuted for their beliefs. The origins go back to Carinthia and Moravia. They were driven out of those areas because they challenged the authority of the Catholic hierarchy, migrated through Europe to Ukraine, and eventually pressured by the then Tsarist government to perform alternative military service and to abandon German in favor of Russian. They migrated to the USA between the period roughly 1874 until most of them were in North America by 1876. This map shows the movement. You notice there's essentially 2 points of origin. The language they speak actually is a dialect, a Tyrolean dialect from Carinthia in Austria. It's not until recently a written language, but recently there have been a couple of books published in that dialect. It's called Hutterites, and they use that in everyday conversation. For religious purposes, they use High German, and for everyday interaction with the outside world, they of course now use English. They're a small group. Over the years, many fell by the wayside because of persecution, and they're down to a relatively small group of surnames that came over to North America. I won't go read them all out to you, but essentially the same group exists now as it existed in 1874-76. Very few people have ever joined the Hutterites. They don't proselytize, and they still are genetically the same group that came over so many years ago. There has been one recent addition. A fellow who joined James Valley Colony is married into the colony, but it's very, very rare that that has occurred. There are three groups, as I said before. They call themselves in German Leute, or in their dialect, the Leiter, the Lehrerleit, the Dariusleit, and the Schmiederleit. The three groups are fundamentally similar, but the Lehrerleit, which literally translates as the teacher's people, are generally regarded as the most conservative, and the Dariusleit are the sort of intermediate group, and the Schmiederleit seen as being the most liberal. In the mid-1990s, the Schmiederlites split into two groups. There was a schism over governance, and now we refer to the Group 1 and the Group 2 colonies, and they don't really affiliate very much. There's still a lot of hard feeling between the two groups. The Group 1 are the more liberal, and the Group 2, generally speaking, more conservative colonies. Oops. Something's popped up on my screen, which I can't get rid of. But we'll go on. Anyway, the Hutterite colony is usually about, consists of about 10, 12 families, usually somewhere between, can be 80, some are smaller, but 80 to 160, 170 people. Most are between 5 and 10,000 acres of land, and family units reside separately, but they eat, live, and they work communally. So all things are held in common, but it's not a true communal life because they do have individual family units and individual family farms. I don't know if you are getting this thing that's happening on mine. As we go. This is a view of a colony in Manitoba founded in the 1980s. And the way that the colony is structured actually demonstrates some of their ideology. The central dining hall, church, and the houses scattered equidistantly around so everyone has equal access to the central facilities. Living area is here, and over to the left-hand side, the agricultural operation. This is a fairly modern colony, and it belongs to the Group 1. James Valley Colony, just 6 miles away, is one of the first colonies to be established in Manitoba when they came to Canada in 1920. And they came to Canada for the same reason that they had moved around Europe. They felt pressured to assimilate, and in the States during the First World War, as German-speaking pacifists, they were very, very unpopular, and they were really very harshly treated. Some of the young men were forcibly conscripted, and 2 of them died in Alcatraz prison for refusing to wear the US Army uniform. So in 1919, they came to Canada. The Schmiederleit came straight north and settled in Manitoba, mostly in Cartier municipality, which is about a dozen or so miles, maybe 40 kilometers, 50 kilometers away from Winnipeg. But the Dariusleit and the Lehrerleit colonies, or just a few of them at that time, moved northwards and went into Alberta. So the Hutterites are really fairly recent arrivals in Canada. They never homesteaded land, they always purchased land because they wanted to get large numbers, large areas. Another colony, Maxwell Colony, one of the original 6 colonies that came to Manitoba in 1919, along the banks of the Assiniboine River, because water was very important for them. And just one last shot of another colony to prove we have winter in Manitoba, Crystal Spring Colony, which is one of the, again, the original colonies established very early on, and is now one of the so-called Group 1 colonies. So the Hutterite life is pretty normal, but they see the colony as an ark, as a kind of a refuge from the sins of the outside world. So in the colony, or they might see it, the ark, they are sailing on a sea of sin, of secular values to which they don't necessarily subscribe. The colonies are usually very well kept, and I just put in a couple of shots to show 2 examples. The housing is very often row housing, but each family unit will have its own dwelling. So because it's an ark in a righteousness and a sea of sin, they want to seek both physical and social isolation from the outside world. They can't, of course, achieve complete social isolation, but you can, to a degree, achieve physical isolation. And they did this over the years by choosing to live in rural areas. The colonies are seldom signed up. If they are visible from the highway, they're very often screened by a row of trees, a kind of shelter belt. And usually for the average person, not the kind of thing one would stumble across in your daily life. Social isolation is more difficult, and that's going to be really the subject of my seminar today, because the whole history of Hutterite life in North America has been one of negotiation with the outside world, trying to establish a relationship which does not allow secular values to penetrate into the colony, yet which still permits the Hutterian community to live and to work and to trade within a so-called maybe Gentile world would be a good expression. So the colony can never be truly isolated, but it does provide pretty much for everything they need. If you join a Hutterite colony, everything is provided. You get your clothing, you get a clothing allowance, that's cloth, you get all your meals, your accommodations. When you travel, you're provided with accommodations, as often as not in another colony, but on occasion in hotels. And if you're a member of the Schmiedelite, you get a $3 monthly allowance, just $3 a month for incidental expenses you might have when you're living on the colony. So money is not something that the Hutterites have much of in their daily lives. The colonies might be sometimes quite wealthy, but individuals certainly are not. The Darius-lite get $20 a month, but they in return don't get money for meals when they travel off the colony. So they don't have a lot of ready cash, which actually creates a problem within the Hutterite community, because money is necessary, and most Hutterites want to have some cash to buy things that they can't get on the colony, like, for example, liquor. They get an allowance of liquor in the year, but it's not very much, and many of them like to drink, so they try and get side money. But getting side money from working in crafts or selling things is not something that the hierarchy approves of. Now, the life on the colony is governed by a series of regulations and conference letters called the Ordnungen und Conference Briefe. this is only pertains, as far as I know, to the Schmiedelite. The Dariusite and the Lehrerite have their own regulations, but very, very similar. This is a document written in High German, and I should point out, for those of you who speak German, the German on the cover is not exactly correct. They use Briefen, not Briefe, and they've used the Briefen, which is the dative case, and not the correct case they should have used. Anyway, these go from 1762 until the present day, and they determine pretty well every aspect of Hutterian life: what is permitted, what is not permitted, how to behave, and what is acceptable and what is not. But it is really a fascinating document, which I was, Yossi and myself, were given by friends of ours in the Schmiedelite colonies, which we have translated and is being reprinted in full in our book, Inside the Ark. To give an example of the kind of regulations, I put the German at the top, and then below the translation. This reflects on computers. Now, computers are something that can let in via the internet the outside secular values, which the Hutterite leadership is anxious to exclude. So this tells us a number of things. It tells us that there are computers in the colonies because it says they must be done away with, but they can't do without them. But they can be allowed for the colony manager and the farm manager, where it's permitted by the council and elders of the church. So they can be used for work purposes, but not for recreational purposes. And we don't want individuals having computers in their home because it's a conduit of alien values into the colony. There are some other things that the Hutterites are concerned about, which is more of a theological concern, and that is that there's a passage in the Bible which said you should not make graven images, and they take this very seriously. So cameras are not allowed. So they say you should not take pictures. There's a huge range of opinion between the leadership of individual colonies about this. Some don't mind colonies pictures being taken as long as there's no people present. Others don't mind people being in pictures as long as they're not posing, and others don't mind if they pose. It varies greatly between colonies, even within the Schmiedelite. There's a huge range. So this is the regulation, a recent regulation, 27th of December 2007, which gives the current status of picture taking. But this has a bearing upon penetration of alien values too, because these days, if one has an iPhone, there's a camera there, and it's natural for one to take pictures. So cameras are not wanted, and certainly not iPhones. Anyway, to go back to the strategy for social isolation, how do you retain your individuality? How do you stay apart from the secular world? One is by language, by persisting in using Hutterisch, this Corinthian dialect in the everyday commerce, but it's changing. There's more and more English being incorporated, and even Hutterisch, the German that they use, has quite a few Ukrainian words adopted from the time in Ukraine. And then there are, of course, English words have been adopted. So terminology for computers and modern agricultural equipment is in English. And you hear more and more English spoken on the colonies. There's a dress code. And then, of course, colony locations. You talked about this a little bit earlier, but they're isolated and screened from view as much as possible. And on Canadian topographic maps, you won't find a Hutterite colony named. It's just shown as a cluster of buildings. But on the American topographic maps, you will find them actually named as a colony. So dress is a good way of retaining social isolation. It's a kind of a uniform that separates them from the outside world, or as they call it, the English. And the dress represents Hutterian values. It varies a little between the different light, but it changes very, very slowly. So some of the things I just want to point out is that women's dress, again, you know, certainly excludes them from easy integration when if they go to town. They're obviously members of a different group, and the dress is strictly controlled. There are regulations as to the length of the skirt and the width of the pleats between different groups. And I knew one young lady who recently got married to she was a Schmiedelite member, and she married a member of the Darius Light, and she had to have a complete new wardrobe because the pleats on the Schmiedelite are about 2 inches wide, and the Darius Light they're about an inch wide, and a lot more narrow, different kind. So she had to have a complete new wardrobe for her marriage. These are Schmiedelite there, and often wear aprons. They always wear a headscarf, sometimes with polka dots, sometimes plain black, and it varies between colonies. It's possible to tell in the street which light a person belongs to by their dress. Men's clothing on the left-hand side is some kids playing in the kindergarten school, and you'll see they're wearing suspenders, black pants. The young women in the background are wearing kind of a bonnet, which they wear until they become adults. And they don't wear belts because that is symbolic of the military. And I don't know if you can see this, but they don't have back pockets in the pants because that's where you carry money, and they don't have any money. So it's a symbolic action of rejecting the values of the outside world. Now, one of the things that really brings the Hutterites into conflict with the outside world is their expansion. They have one of the world's highest birth rates, so certainly did, although they don't approve of birth control. It's pretty obvious to me that birth control is employed because birth rates are falling. And they have to, they can't have a colony which is much more than 200 people because it becomes dysfunctional, as there are no more jobs for people, and people want the chance to become, you know, head of a section of the colony, the head of the pig barn, the cow barn, the turkey operation, or be the mechanic or the carpenter or what have you. So they have to expand, and that brings them into conflict with the outside world. Land is an issue to get land, and this often causes resentment from established non-Hutterite populations who allege that they are building up land prices and they are not welcome in those areas. And so this adds to the pressure that they feel from the outside world, which is one that they have to conform to perform military service, which they of course will refuse to do. And there are a lot of allegations they ruin rural communities because they buy in bulk from the big cities, which is not really true. They don't adopt English. They still persist in retaining Hutterisch, although most of them speak English widely, and I guess the more English comes in, the more easy it is for outside values to penetrate. But the goal of the outside society has also been assimilation, and that is in direct conflict with Hutterite values. So I wanted to just show you the way in which Hutterite colonies branch out. They from James Valley, for example, in 1918 came to Canada, and then as its population expanded, it spun off a series of daughter colonies, and of course this puts pressure on land in the area and beyond it. And in Cartier municipality, which is just a little bit, 40, 50 kilometers west of Winnipeg, the density got quite high and caused a lot of people, for local farmers, to say they were driving on land prices and that they were going to dominate rural society, and this didn't want this to happen. So there's right the way across the prairies, in the interwar period, there was a growing resentment of Hutterite expansion. A lot of it simply because they were different. And this resentment saw manifestation in legal barriers. In Alberta, during the Second World War, they established the Communal Property Act, which essentially restricted sale of land to Hutterites and laid conditions down as to where they could settle. It certainly had a huge impact upon the geography of Hutterian settlement in Western Alberta. And you can see them down here. It was really anti-Hutterite because they were German and pacifist. In Manitoba, there was similar kinds of concerns expressed by non-Hutterite farmers, and they didn't pass any legislation, but they signed a gentleman's agreement, which between the period of 57 to 69 restricted their purchases of lands to colonies to 5,120 acres, and they specified they could not be any more than 2 colonies in any one municipality, and they should be at least 10 miles apart. Saskatchewan had a similar kind of gentleman's agreement, which lasted from 58 to 68, and the same kind of requirements to try and spread them out and stop them becoming a dominant element of the population in any one area. So I'm just going to whip through some maps showing the effect that this kind of legislation had upon the growth of the Hutterites. So 1874, they established a couple of colonies down here, the first to come in, and they're color-coded. The blue are Darius light, the red are Lehr light, and the green circles are Schmiede light. And you'll see as they 1875 to 79, still in the States down in the area of South Dakota, 1884, and we're going to go through, and now in the early 1890s, when at the time of the Spanish-American War, they established a colony in Manitoba as a kind of a bridgehead in case conscription was introduced, but it wasn't, and so very quickly that colony was abandoned and disappeared from the landscape. So by 1909, it had essentially gone, and then everything was fine until 1914, and then expansion really changed because they came into Canada to escape harassment from US authorities. And thereafter, the birth rate really caused them to expand. But you can see in Manitoba, it was all in this one area. And they went back to the States too, and the Lehr light and Darius light went into Montana and over here into Alberta. By 54, they're really clustering tightly in southern Alberta, and this is when the effects of the Communal Property Act came into effect, and you can see they began to diffuse to northern Alberta and then eventually into BC. So by 2003, there's a cluster in the States here in North and South Dakota, cluster in Manitoba, the Schmiede light, and then the Lehr light and Darius light are in Alberta, go into Washington State and Montana, and into Saskatchewan. The 3 colonies, the Schmiede light in Manitoba have recently bought land in this area, just inside the Saskatchewan border. And I was talking with a member of a colony in Saskatchewan fairly recently, and he said the Schmiede light should stay in Manitoba. We don't want them over here. They're driving up land prices. So, you know, it's what goes around comes around, I guess. Anyway, this is the most recent map I have made of the Hutterite colonies in North America. I say North America because there is one in Japan, a very small one in Nigeria, and there's some quasi-Hutterite colonies in New Zealand. But this is the present status, and it's good. They're going to move in, expand into Saskatchewan in this area within the next decade. So the problem with mainstream society really are that of community resistance. A lot of people fear alien dominance. I still can detect amongst people very often a kind of resentment of Hutterites, or why don't they assimilate? Why are they different? And because multiculturalism itself has actually caused some issues for the Hutterites because they don't want to assimilate. They want to remain different. And then I just referred again to the barriers that they faced in Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan, which of course now have been removed. But multiculturalism itself, poses threats. People expect them to assimilate, and with prevailing attitudes, it's become more difficult to separate themselves from mainstream society. In fact, it's kind of ironic, but the Hutterites maybe do better in some ways when the outside world is antagonistic, because that causes them to to close ranks, to stay within the ark, to reduce their contacts with the outside world. But when the outside world is welcoming and wants them to come in and embraces them, it removes that barrier. So it's like, in a way, if you use an analogy, it's like punching holes in the ark, and it leads to the percolation into the colony of secular ideals. So it's become more difficult to maintain separation, but what has really caused havoc is communications revolution, which has meant penetration of values have become ever more easy. The other big threat, I'll talk a little bit about the penetration of values through the digital aspect in a moment. But one of the greatest threats as far as the Hutterites are concerned is that of evangelical churches, the Church of God, Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists, and so on, those that proselytize. And I had one Alberta colony leader tell me that one of these evangelists, he was worse than the devil himself, because they promise personal salvation without having to commit yourself to communal living. And they offer a refuge, they offer instant acceptance, but still retain one's Christian idealism. But as transition to the outside world has gotten easier, defection rates amongst the Hutterites have become higher in general. Because when times are bad, there's not much inducement to leave the colony, even if one has a crisis of faith. You might just stay around because that's where you have you're living, and you have a lot of security. But as there are ever more Hutterites in the outside world, it becomes easier to leave. Defectors have more likely to have outside contacts to help them make the transition into the outside world. And during the hydrocarbon boom, which has now ceased, the oil industry in Alberta and Saskatchewan took a huge number of Hutterites who have a strong work ethic and very often the skills that they needed to have in the outside world as welders, as mechanics, and so on. Those that do leave the colony, which is no easy step, because you're leaving your complete way of life and your relatives behind, they generally link up with other ex-Hutterites, or they join other similar Christian institutions who look after themselves. They tend to go for institutional linkages. Many of the defectors that leave end up in, I would say, quite radical Christian churches. The colony promises a simple life, but really it's one that embraces agricultural technology. There's often a misconception that Hutterites are like the Amish and they live a very, very simple life with oil lamps and so on. Nothing could be further from the truth. They embrace technology. The only technology that they don't like is technology that allows the outside world into the colony. So their agriculture is highly mechanized. It's seldom organic. They use a lot of fertilizer, a lot of chemicals. And they say usually, if we don't, we may well starve. So they figure they have to. Technology which makes their life easier in the house, they will adopt. Microwaves are common, toasters, toaster ovens in the houses which they prepare snacks in. All modern conveniences are eagerly adopted. It's only those that enable the penetration of outside values that are pretty well abandoned. I'm just going to go back, so one of the issues that they have to contend with, which is actually exposing them to the outside world in a greater way, is the fact that land is so expensive these days. They're moving ever further apart to get land, and land is not always of the best quality. Agricultural quotas are a problem for them. Agriculture itself these days doesn't yield a huge return on investment, and there are limited job opportunities with mechanized agriculture. These aren't the jobs for people in the colony. So many of them are now moving into industry. I took these pictures on the Willow Creek colony and down in southwestern Manitoba just a few months ago, and you see that this is a way of life of a modern Hutterite on the colony. They build Canuck trailers, they're called, these huge trailers, and they have a ready market. Evergreen colony in Manitoba, for example, builds custom fire engines and so on. There's many different occupations. Some of the issues that maybe bear to on penetration of values is that of gender and democracy. Work is highly gendered in the Hutterite colony. Women do domestic work, men work in agriculture or industrial endeavors. Women have no vote on colony affairs. I don't know whether this will change. Most women I've talked to are not bothered by this. They say we tell our husbands how to vote, and there's a certain truth to that. But the nature of work redresses the imbalance of power on the colony. Men tend to work in isolation. This is on agricultural colonies. In industry, it's not quite so true. But women tend to work in groups, either in the kitchen, as you can see on the top photograph, or working in pairs or groups if they're preparing food. This process making tomato soup on James Valley Colony. Two women working together. So women have an informal network. So even an unmarried woman can make her views known to the other women, who will then transfer their views to their husbands, and one hopes the husbands will vote accordingly. Now, the digital revolution, of course, is the most recent and the greatest threat of all. It threatens the separation from the outside world, and so on colonies, radio is frowned upon. I have seen radios on colonies. Television, if it's on colonies at all, is usually only for educational purposes or is illicit. Cell phones are not supposed to be allowed, or weren't supposed to be allowed, though the regulations have recently specified that they can have a cell phone as long as it doesn't have a camera. But on the other hand, these days it's very hard to buy a cell phone without a camera. You have to have cell phones really for modern day business. When Hutterites are freighting gravel or freighting wheat, you need to be able to contact the driver of colony. They used to use CB radios, but cell phones are far better and more convenient. So some of them have a policy where you can get a cell phone on a sign-out basis, but even more have their own cell phone. And it's still frowned upon, but it's a fact of life. Another way that outside values penetrate is that colonies are in constant contact with the world if they're trying to conduct business, or they're trying to buy seed or sell produce. And sales representatives will offer all kinds of inducements to the Hutterites responsible for that particular area of the colony. Things like hockey and football game tickets, liquor, restaurant meals, cash, and so on, are dispensed by sales reps. Now, this is all not approved of, and it's not supposed to take place, but it does. And I have been to hockey games in Winnipeg, and I've been fortunate enough to be given a ticket by a friend of mine, and I've been seeing rows, literally 4 or 5 Hutterites eating pizza and sitting watching the hockey game in sort of high-priced seats. And you don't buy these high-priced seats on $3 a day. So, sorry, $3 a month allowance. So obviously they're getting these tickets from somewhere, and probably it has to be, I think, from sales representatives. So cell phones now, as I said before, commonly used. As a rare picture of a Hutterite conducting business on a cell phone in a greenhouse operation. But iPhones still are pretty well strictly forbidden or if the colony leadership sees them around, they will turn a blind eye. So one of the things that really has always surprised me about the Hutterites is the way they've managed to negotiate a relationship with the outside world, and it's becoming more and more difficult. And there have been many people have prophesied the end of the Hutterite colony in the next 15 years. That was way back in the 60s. There were some articles I read that said the Hutterite colony just isn't going to survive. But I think they will. And I think they will because of the wisdom of the leadership and their gradual accommodation of change. They don't easily accept it, but they monitor it, they put the brakes on, and they know when to take the brakes off. So it's a very, very skillful negotiation of governance vis-a-vis the outside world and the people who live in the colony itself. Defection rates tend to be high in good times and lower in bad times. But just one last word about defection. Those who leave the colony, a high proportion of them come back. It's not unusual. I've met many Hutterites who've left the colony, been away for 5, sometimes 10 years. On one occasion, has worked on the oil rigs in Madagascar, in Alberta, in the States, and eventually comes back into the colony, marries, and settles down to a very tranquil life. So leadership, I think, is doing something right in negotiating this change within the colony. A colony today, whatever it is in North America, is a very different place to the colony you had encountered in 1914, just as the outside world is a very different place. So I think that I've used up my 40 minutes now, and so I'll call it a day. And if any of you have any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them. And if I can't answer them, then you can go to the answers to one of the editions of the book I wrote with Yossi Katz, which I think is a fairly comprehensive look at the Hutterite colony. And also, if you're really interested, the appendix, which is almost half the book in each case, shows the Osnungun and Conference Brief and the rules and regulations from 1772 until 1912, I think, in the last edition. So, thank you, and if you have any questions, please fire away.
All right. Okay, John, thanks for that presentation. And it is a good mention about the book, because that's through the Regina University Press. That's how your work came to our attention. So we appreciate taking the time to share some of your insights into the culture and practices that have existed here in North America. While I'm logging into our Q&A here, I had a couple thoughts on, where you might anticipate some of their cultures going forward, because as technology improves, it seems that the ability to perhaps keep out outside influence might be further strained in the future. So I don't know, do you have any insights on, or through your speakings with some of the leaders, on how they anticipate they'll be able to kind of curtail the influence of the outside world, because technology does seem to be increasing, especially with education? Do they see any way of adopting some technologies and not others, or do they see specific technologies as being a challenge to their way of life?
Yeah, well, I guess you would know that the more liberal Group 1 colonists have quite a number of students in the Hutterian education program at Brandon University, which trains teachers, so they go to the degree level. The Group 2, the conservative colonists, don't do this, so that's a marked difference between the two elements of the Schmiede life. But certainly education levels are improving. It's no longer unusual to find a Hutterite with grade 12. Many of them do online or distance education courses, I should say. Used to be done mostly by correspondence to get their apprenticeship for being an electrician or a plumber or what have you. So that the colony has a range of fairly highly educated males who are into the trades. They don't see much value in the humanities. They're very practical and very applied people. On Group 1 colonies, you'll find television in the schools, but it's used really just for playing DVDs and educational movies and so on. The Group 2 engage in distance education up to high school, and it's increasingly common now for even women to get grade 12, where it didn't 15, 20 years ago. It was somewhat unusual, I think, for a woman to have grade 12 in the colony. But of course, and I've argued in our book that the Hutterites can't afford to lose half of their intellectual capital by confining women to domestic work. And I think this is actually changing. As they industrialize, there are more and more jobs for women as office workers and so on, and doing jobs that can be done equally well by a man or a woman. The old days when hard physical work was done by a man, could only be done by a man, I think have long gone. And I was told by, this is second-hand information, but I was told by some members of the Darius Light that in the Lehr colonies in Alberta, which had very, very high defection rates during the oil boom, that many women were forced to do jobs traditionally done by men because of a labor shortage. So many men had left. That, well, I think will change as they drift back, with the decline of employment in the oil patch. But yeah, the education, of course, carries risks. It is a conduit of different values, and so the leadership is very careful how they expose their members to these alien influences.
Great. I have a question from Gus Ruck. Do you see Hutterites being trained in the professions such as veterinary medicine or human medicine?
In the short term, no. And I don't really know. You know, they're very pragmatic, and the leadership is really pragmatic. So I think that if it became necessary, I can't see them going into like medicine in a general sense. But it's a gradual process. And a couple of weeks ago, I was on a colony in Saskatchewan where our host was also a first responder with the local community. So there is that kind of integration. But I don't think in my lifetime I will see the Hutterites sending young people to become vets or maybe veterinary assistant perhaps, but certainly not a vet nor a doctor. I just don't see that happening.
Okay.
And bookkeepers, but not accountants.
Okay, good. Brian Beaton has a question here too. At the start of the presentation, there was a brief reference to a long period of gaining trust. How long did it take? How is the trust maintained? And is there a strong feeling and understanding of trust across the community, or is it just with the leadership?
There's an easy question and a hard question all rolled up in one.
There's a couple in there, so yeah. I guess the first part was how long did it take to establish that trust?
Well, I can maybe explain by my own experience. I was introduced to the people on James Valley Colony by an American professor who had somehow established a link, and he took some field trips there, and I'd taken the students on field trips around Ukrainian settlements, and they invited me along. So that would be in the early 1980s, I first visited a Manitoba Hutterite colony. And I established a link with the minister there, John Hofer. He was slightly older than me. and I used to take my students on field trips occasionally. And I always felt that having a German name, despite my English accent, of German origins, and that helped a bit. I wasn't one of the English, I was kind of quasi-English. And then in the mid-1990s, I took my friend Yossi Katz over to visit James Valley, and long story, but eventually Yossi invited some Hutterite leaders, including John, to attend a conference in Israel, and I went with them, escorted them to Israel, and that happened on 2 occasions. I spent time in Israel conferences with Hutterites that I escorted to the conference, and it was during these journeys I really got to know people well, and so over the past years, my family know Hutterites, and I know like an extended family on different colonies. And I think when I wrote the book with Yossi, they read the manuscript before we published it, and they saw that we weren't out to write some scathing indictment of Hutterite life, but we were fair and dispassionate, and they gradually we just built up a friendship. So as a matter of fact, we have some guests coming in for supper tonight from a colony in town, and they're going to come over, 4 people, and
I guess I'll add to the second part of that question was that gaining trust, was that amongst the entire community or just with the leadership?
Well, it's really it goes by family, really. I mean, if I was to show up on a colony where I wasn't known and say, you know, here I am, I want to be shown around the colony, they'd probably invite me to leave. But if I had a friend of mine phone up beforehand and say, this guy's going to be coming and he's a friend of mine, it would probably be quite fine.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I've seen some colonies in Alberta which have said absolutely no visitors. In other words, they're not a curiosity. They don't like people just rolling up and saying, you know, wow, this is different. Can I look around? They'd say no. But it's like everybody else, I guess. Hutterites, I've found over the years, are exactly like you and me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They live communally.
I found the comments about diversifying their work as being vital to the survival of their community, of course, because of the mechanization of agriculture. You know, there are only so many jobs in the agriculture, so now many of them have expanded into other types of work. I know you mentioned a couple colonies that I've been to where they do trailers, or they work with metal, and they've expanded that service to the neighboring communities. I know a couple community organizations have put in commercial kitchens with aluminum counters and everything. Are there other industries that perhaps in your experience that they are also considering expanding in?
Yeah, well, of course, let me preface that with an anecdote which I think will illustrate something about the Hutterites. I have a friend on a colony just north of Winnipeg, and I expressed a desire to see the colony. So I was invited out, and I wanted to see the industrial operation. And I said, is it okay if I take pictures? And they said, oh, we don't allow any pictures. And I said, okay, that's fine. They said, oh, but you're not a Hutterite, that'll be okay. In other words, I wasn't a Hutterite, so I could take pictures. And I said, what is going on? They said, well, if it's a Hutterite from another colony, you might take pictures and he might get an idea of our technology and they'll just replicate it and they'll compete. Because the Hutterites don't patent things, they don't believe in that. Mm-hmm. So everything is fair game. So they're more worried about industrial espionage from fellow Hutterites than they are from a person like me who they knew doesn't know one end of a lathe from another. And we're just taking general pictures, not detailed pictures of equipment. So yeah, so there is a concern about not stealing, but I guess borrowing technology. But the kind of things they're going into, there's colonies who specialize in woodworking, those that specialize in molded plastic, not picture frames, window frames. Just about everything you can think of. Laser cutting is big. And again, one colony started it, and others said, oh, that's a great idea, we'll do that. And now there's a lot of competition. Many colonies that are not industrialized do kind of side jobs which bring in money. They will take wrecked semi-trailers on one colony that I know of, and they will straighten the frame. They'll buy the wreck for maybe $25,000, but they'll fix it up and sell it for $100 grand. So it's not really an industry, but it's a way of creating income from the colony.
Mm-hmm. Well, the thing that I found fascinating, of course, is for many rural communities, diversification is seen as a way to help try to keep them viable. So in many ways, they're just like every other community out there that, with the changing world, with mechanization of certain industries, they're just like all the other communities that identify that other sources of income and diversification in their economy is necessary to keep their community viable. I'm kind of switching back and forth between topics because I have different questions coming in from a couple different people. So I'll continue with Brian Beaton that mentioned about that gaining trust, and a follow-up comment on Brian says, I'm in awe of the growth of the communities over just 150 years. What is the population size of each of the communities? Is their food supply limited to what the growth is and produced with a single community? What are the sizes of their livestock herds and gardens?
Well, yeah, first of all, the growth. It's very difficult to get an exact tally, but I worked with James Murphy from James Valley Colony, and James is one of the few people I know of who's actually joined the Hutterite community and has married a Hutterite girl, is firmly ensconced, has children, and James is really welcomed in the community. He was they sent him to Germany to learn German for a year, and he learned Hutterisch on the colony, and now has 6 children, and has been a huge genetic boost to the rather limited genetic pool of Hutterites. But anyway, I worked with James, and as we can figure out, there are, in the last count, there are 508 colonies, and population probably, this is only an estimate, we don't have an exact count. We reckon there's probably around about 50,000 people in North America. Colonies regions, there's one I know is just branching out now, and they have 160 people on it, and they say it's too big. And so they recently bought land out in western Manitoba, and it's referred to now as the James Valley Farm. It has a name, but they've got some housing there. They've built some agricultural buildings, but they probably won't be a fully fledged colony. They won't actually hive off and split for maybe another 6 years, maybe 10 years.
Yeah, is it kind of standard, the size of how, like, do they grow to a certain point and then there's a certain point where they decide to split? Is there a specific number for that before they decide to split?
Yeah, well, it's more of a feeling, I think. People in James Valley were saying to me, we're getting too big and we have to start thinking about land. So they've been thinking about splitting for the past 4 or 5 years. And they were looking at various options of where to go, or how to do it. One of the big problems of splitting a colony, of course, is that it's very hard to get quotas for dairy and for chickens and pigs and so on. So that is a restricting factor. there are some colonies I know split, and one colony, recent colony in Manitoba, only has 100 acres of land because they're totally industrial, and the 100 acres is just to grow their own food.
Mm-hmm. Is there food
in Manitoba? I would say the average, most usual size would be between 5,000 to 9,000 acres, and the average colony size, median, probably would be about 110, 120.
Mm-hmm.
There is a size which is too small to exist. Much below 40, you've only got a couple of families. But too small. 200 is too unwieldy. So at 200, they'd be in the process, but well along the process towards splitting.
Yeah. And is the food limited to just what they produce? Like,
no. They buy things that they can't make. They buy ice cream.
Okay.
They buy margarine. A lot of the food is their own. On some colonies, they make their own cheese, but they're not allowed to sell it because of quotas.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
They can. Some colonies will produce their own meat. I know one colony which has its own dairy herd of 4 cattle, just to provide milk to the colony. It's not doesn't enter, as long as it doesn't enter into the marketplace, they can pretty well do what they want, I think. But yeah, it is. Quotas are a really important factor. Most colonies that I'm aware of have a garden, and the garden is about probably around the 30 acres or so, and they'll grow raspberries, strawberries, squash, onions, beans, potatoes, beets, just general garden produce. And they will, if there's too much, they'll ship it into Winnipeg and they'll sell it at farmers markets, or they'll supply the local grocery stores.
Okay. I have a couple of questions from the PLS, which I assume is the library services. They have an office here in Brandon. Is there anything unique about how they seek medical treatment or information?
No, they use medical facilities like anybody else.
Great. Okay.
And they have no restrictions on blood transfusions or X-rays or any medical procedure that I know of.
Okay. Is there inter-colony cooperation? Do they communicate and visit each other? If so, what for?
Yeah, they travel amazingly between colonies, and this is one way that they mix up their young people so they find wives. And you don't want to marry from the same colony because they tend to be all more or less related, and they keep very, very detailed genealogical records. So as soon as two young people express an interest in each other, they will consult the genealogical tables to ensure that they're not related. They will not allow marriage between first cousins. Between second cousins is strongly discouraged. So they try to diversify the genetic pool as much as possible.
That's good. Sarah F. asks, do land use planning policies impact the development of the colonies?
Yeah, but I can't really give you a good answer on that. I just know that they are bound by the rules of everyone else in terms of disposal of, say, pig manure, for example, and they cooperate with provincial agricultural branch to ensure that they maintain standards. But beyond that, I can't say very much.
Mm-hmm. And I think you mentioned too about quotas also impact their ability a little bit, because obviously if they were to split and they're limited by industry, that would kind of limit their ability to split off, right?
Yeah. One of the reasons I was told recently why the Hutterites in Manitoba are moving into Saskatchewan is that it's a little bit easier get hog production quotas.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So that is a factor. So they're aware of this, and I have known that some colonies have actually split the quota.
Is that purely based on provincial policy, or is it just is it an oversaturation in Manitoba, or?
I think partly provincial policy.
Okay.
But again, they are highly sensitive to fluctuations in the market. The colony not far from Brandon, actually, that was big into pigs, and I visited. I hadn't been there for about a year, and the pig barns were entirely empty. And they said, "Oh, there's no money in pigs. We got out of pigs, but now they're back in because prices went up." So they will respond to the market.
Okay, that's very interesting.
Every colony is different. You know, some colonies are multi-income. They have some agriculture, some dairying, a bit of manufacturing. They spread it all around. Others are highly industrial, with very little involvement in the outside agricultural market. And others are just respond to market, and they'll switch around operations according to prices.
Very interesting. That's good. I see that we are kind of at the end of our questions here. Actually, if I have one more. Brian Beaton, I'm curious about John's academic interest in the Hutterites. Is it social, economic, political, agricultural? Are there lessons being learned that would benefit our own political, socioeconomic society? Maybe that's a good wrap-up question.
Okay, I think first of all, my interest in Hutterites was sparked because they were so different, and I just found them a fascinating community. So I'm interested in the way of life and the social aspect. I would never claim to be an expert on Hutterite economics, like I'm sure Brian's familiar with John Ryan's book, The Agricultural Economy of Hutterites in Manitoba, which he came out in the 1970s, I believe, which is a very, very detailed study of the agricultural operations of Hutterite colonies at that time. I'm more interested in just the general way of life and how they adapt to change, and how they manage themselves, how they expand, and how the colony is run.
Interesting. And I guess any lessons that could benefit our own political, socioeconomic society on the whole, I guess?
Yeah, I think that the way they govern, which is largely by consensus, although I said before, women don't have a vote, when it comes to agricultural operations, most of the women, to put it bluntly, are just not interested. Although that's not true of all of them, but most women I've talked to were terribly interested in, you know, the merits of one kind of harvester over another. But they seem to have a very good way of gauging the opinion of the colony, and making decisions which aren't imposed. They don't impose decisions which are highly unpopular, because the colony wouldn't like it. So it's very democratic in some ways, even though it hasn't got the structures of democracy in the way that we might expect in the outside world. Every colony functions like a small village, and everyone sort of knows everybody else. And they've often known them from childhood, so they will tend to. There's a lot of consensual decision making. It's not very seldom are things imposed from above. And also the leadership, from my experience, knows when to turn a blind eye. They know when to overlook transgressions, when to let things slide, and when to clamp down. I've actually been very impressed with the wisdom of a lot of Hutterite leaders that I've come to know or have known, and they've always impressed me with a very pragmatic and wise approach to colony governance.
Okay. I have a couple. I think I got all the questions, which I have one person saying that I didn't. But perhaps if there's any other further questions, I think we will wrap up, and that perhaps they can email myself or yourself for follow-up information. Do you have an email address, John, that would, if anyone's interested in getting a hold of you?
Yeah, it's very easy. It's J, it's all lowercase, j.lehr@uwinnipeg.ca.
Okay, that's perfect. And as John mentioned, if the second edition of Inside the Ark, the Hutterites in Canada and the United States is available from the University of Regina Press on behalf of the Rural Policy Learning Commons. I thank John for his presentation today and for speaking with me. It was a pleasure to speak with you, John. And for anyone interested in more information on the RPLC or some of our webinars, please do contact us by visiting our website or also emailing us. We're happy to include you in our group, our emails, our webinars, and spreading more information about rural policy, rural life, and helping make lives better for everyone in rural. So thanks again, John. And for those that are interested in a copy of the video, please visit the RPLC YouTube channel, and we'll also have copies of the slides available for you to view. So thanks again, John.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Great. Take care.
Yeah, bye-bye.